Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, June 13th. We begin our cast with a look at household credit market debt. Statistics Canada says the amount Canadians owe relative to their income pulled back in the first quarter as incomes grew faster than debt. The agency says household credit market debt as a proportion of disposable income fell to 182.5% in the first 3 months of this year. Now that's down from a record 185% in the previous quarter. The decrease came as household credit market debt grew 2.0%, but disposable income gained 3.3%. Meanwhile, a new survey by Manulife Bank of Canada finds that 2/3 of Canadians do not view home ownership as affordable in their local community. And nearly 1 in 4 homeowners say they will have to sell their home if interest rates go up further. The Bank of Canada is expected to impose another rate hike soon as it works to tame 6.8% inflation. The Manulife survey, conducted in mid-April, found that 18% of homeowners polled are already at a stage where they can't afford their homes. Canadian Blood Services says it is struggling to replenish a critically low supply of blood. The organization says the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has left it with the smallest donor base in a decade. Spokesman Rick Prinzen says the number of people who donate regularly has dropped by 31,000 since the pandemic began. This is National Blood Donor Week, and the aim is to attract 100,000 new donors this year. But summer is a slow time for donations, and people cancel appointments or go on vacation. All right, turning to Toronto now, where grief and anger filled a Toronto courtroom this morning. This came as those affected by the city's deadly 2018 van attack gave victim impact statements at a sentencing hearing. 11 people died after a 25-year-old man deliberately drove a rented van down a busy sidewalk. This hearing was the first opportunity victims and families have had to face Alec Manassian in person, as his trial was conducted entirely online. He was sentenced today to life in prison. On the East Coast, Newfoundland and Labrador is getting ready to welcome another plane load of Ukrainian refugees tomorrow. The plane is scheduled to land in St. John's, and it will be the second plane chartered by the provincial government bringing Ukrainians to the province. Newfoundland and Labrador has led the Canadian effort to resettle Ukrainians fleeing Russian attacks on their home country. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he has tested positive for COVID-19 for a second time. Mr. Trudeau says on Twitter today that he will be isolating and that he feels okay. He says that is because he has been vaccinated against the novel coronavirus. The Prime Minister is encouraging everyone to get vaccinated, including with a booster dose to protect themselves, others, and the healthcare system. Mr. Trudeau also tested positive for COVID-19 at the end of January after one of his children tested positive. Moving to Alberta now, where a shortage of nurses continues to impact the healthcare sector. Alberta Health Services says the emergency department at a healthcare center in the province's north is temporarily closed. AHS says in a news release that nursing staff will still be at the Wabasca des Marais Healthcare Center to triage patients, and that it's exploring options to reopen the ER as soon as possible. The health delivery agency said that recruitment of nurses is a challenge across North America and that it has a dedicated team focused on recruitment efforts. Environment Canada has warnings for the West Coast. It says that the increased rain today and tomorrow may cause flooding in parts of British Columbia. The biggest area of concern remains the Liard River in northeastern BC. The East Kootenay region has been upgraded to a flood watch for rivers in the upper Columbia regions and their tributaries. The U.S. National Weather Service says the Columbia River has been pushed to near flood stage from Vancouver to Longview, Washington. All right, turning to a new study which finds young teens need as little as 20 minutes of vigorous physical activity a day. Researchers from Oxford University studied more than 300 adolescents aged 13 to 14 and found that longer, vigorous exercise was strongly associated with greater cardiorespiratory fitness. Light and moderate exercise did not show the same results. The World Health Organization currently recommends adolescents get 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day, but 81% of them are still not doing that. Newfoundland and Labrador has the highest rate of satisfaction with life of any province across the country. That's according to new data released by Statistics Canada. According to their numbers, just over 61% of people gave a life satisfaction rating between 8 and 10. That number is much higher than the average for Canada as a whole, which is 51%. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. The head of the Canadian Airports Council says Ottawa's suspension of randomized COVID-19 testing at customs marks a big step toward draining the clogged terminals. But Monette Pasher says more measures are needed to clear the runway. Ms. Pasher says wait times and delays on the tarmac at large airports improved immediately after the change went into effect on Saturday. But the Airports Council and other industry groups are now calling for an end to vaccine mandates for passengers and aviation employees. The Liberal government is cutting short debate on its online streaming bill. The Conservatives accuse the Liberals of attempting to rush the bill through the Commons without proper scrutiny. The legislation known as Bill C-11 would regulate streaming services such as Netflix, YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok. The Liberals have given MPs until midnight to table amendments to the bill. They have until Tuesday to scrutinize it clause by clause in committee. A provincially imposed public inquiry begins today in Ottawa to look at the city's troubled light rail system. The $2 billion Confederation LRT line has been beset with problems since it opened. That's including everything from service delays, overcrowded platforms, stations that smell of sewage, to derailments and showers of sparks flying off the train cars. The inquiry will hear testimony from city staff and the consortium that built the line. A prominent Jewish organization is speaking out against Quebec's new language law. B'nai B'rith says the law will make it harder to recruit rabbis and could push Jewish people to leave the province. CEO Michael Mostin says he's concerned that many Jewish immigrants, including elderly people from Ukraine and the former Soviet Union, will no longer be able to access services in English. The law known as Bill 96 imposes stricter language rules for workplaces, and it limits who can receive government communication and services in languages other than French. Caroline Simard, Vice Chairperson of Broadcasting at the CRTC, has been appointed as Canada's new elections watchdog. The Chief Electoral Officer of Canada, Stéphane Perreault, today announced that Ms. Simard would start as Commissioner of Canada Elections in August. The Commissioner is responsible for enforcement of elections law and conducts investigations into breaches, along with other enforcement activities. Ms. Simard takes over from Yves Côté, who is finishing a 10-year term as Commissioner of Canada Elections. A suburban Montreal high school has recalled more than 900 yearbooks after a racial slur was found hidden in a student biography. The Lester B. Pearson School Board says 2 students at McDonald High School wrote a series of words separated by commas, with the first letters of the words forming the slur. The board is condemning the students' actions as extremely inappropriate and unacceptable. A spokesperson says the slur went unnoticed during the editing process, but people took note on social media at the end of last week. A rainfall warning remains in effect for the Alberta foothills. Environment Canada says it expects between 75 and 125 millimeters of rain in parts of southern and central Alberta by Wednesday morning. Some areas, including the city of Calgary, could see up to 150 millimeters. There are warnings that heavy downpours could cause flash floods and water pooling on roads. Calgary says it has lowered water levels at upstream reservoirs on the Bow and Elbow rivers to make room for potential flood water. Meanwhile, British energy giant BP is exiting the Alberta oil sands to focus instead on offshore oil development in Newfoundland and Labrador. BP is acquiring a 35% stake in the undeveloped Bay du Nord project, which is about 500 kilometers east of St. John's. This is part of a deal to sell its 50% interest in the Sunrise Oil Sands project to Calgary-based Cenovus. It will also receive a $600 million cash payment and a variable payment of up to $600 million, expiring after 2 years. BP currently holds an interest in 6 exploration licenses in the offshore eastern Newfoundland region. North Korea's state media says leader Kim Jong-un and his top deputies are pushing for a crackdown. They are targeting officials accused of abusing their power and committing other unsound and non-revolutionary acts. The comments come as Mr. Kim pushes for greater internal unity to overcome a COVID-19 outbreak and economic difficulties. Bidding for a final private lunch with Warren Buffett has already reached $3 million US. The online auction raises money for a California charity that helps the homeless. It began yesterday and continues throughout Friday night. The lunch is already proving pricey, but the bidding remains well below the 2019 record of about $4.5 million. We'll be right back after the break with a look at news happening around the world, from the WTO to the UN. Stay tuned. The head of the World Trade Organization predicted a bumpy and rocky road as it opened its highest-level meeting in over 4 years. The 4-day meeting opened yesterday in Geneva, and top issues include pandemic preparedness, food insecurity during high inflation, the war in Ukraine, and overfishing of the world's seas. The WTO's Director General said she hopes the meeting yields progress toward reducing inequality and ensuring fair and free trade. Delegates will consider whether to lift or ease export restrictions to help alleviate war-related shortages of wheat, fertilizer, and other products. The UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, says she will not seek a new 4-year term. This comes after the current one has been overshadowed by criticism of her response to China's treatment of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in western Xinjiang. Ms. Bachelet announced this move in her opening address to the latest session of the UN-backed Human Rights Council. Rights Office spokeswoman Ravina Shamdasani confirmed that meant Ms. Bachelet, a former president of Chile, would not be seeking a second 4-year term when the current one ends on August 31st. Germany's Vice Chancellor is proposing new powers for the country's antitrust agency. This is to clamp down on oil companies amid disappointment over the limited effect of a cut in fuel taxes. A 3-month cut took effect on June 1st. This was part of a wider package of measures aimed at blunting the financial fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there have been widespread complaints that prices at the pump have been creeping back up substantially after initially falling. Industry representatives insist that the tax reduction is being passed on to consumers. Many politicians accuse oil companies of using the tax cut to line their own pockets. Attacks by Islamic extremists are on the rise, 5 months after mutinous soldiers overthrew Burkina Faso's democratically elected president. Analysts say that could undermine support for coup leader Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damibe's regime. Many in Burkina Faso supported the military takeover. They are frustrated with the previous government's inability to stem Islamic extremist violence that has killed thousands. But the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project found that violence linked to extremists increased by nearly 7% during Mr. Damibe's first 3 months of rule. Mr. Damibe has asked citizens to give him until September to see an improvement in Burkina Faso's security. Spain's economy minister has linked a recent move by Algeria with what she said is the North African country's increasing alignment with Russia. This was regarding Algeria's decision to suspend a decades-old friendship treaty with Spain. Nadia Calvino told Catalunya Radio on Monday that in recent international meetings, she noticed that Algeria was more and more aligned with Russia. And as such, the decision didn't surprise her. The suspension last Wednesday was seen as a retaliation for Spain backing Morocco in the long-standing dispute over the contested territory of the Western Sahara. Spain's chief worry has been that the suspension might affect important gas supplies from Algeria. Philippine officials are warning that people can face arrest if they defy a presidential order to wear face masks in public to protect against the coronavirus. This even in a province where the governor has declared them as optional. Officials asked the governor of Central Cebu province to cooperate with President Rodrigo Duterte's order. But she insists that her decision to allow people to decide whether to wear masks in her province has legal grounds. A government official says the presidential order should be followed by all local officials and that the country remains under a public health emergency despite the easing of the outbreak. LGBTQ advocates in the U.S. say polarization and a fraught political climate have put their community increasingly at risk. More than 24 alleged members of a white supremacist group were arrested near a northern Idaho Pride event over the weekend. Police say the 31 Patriot Front members were arrested with riot gear. This came after a tipster reported seeing people loading into a U-Haul at a hotel parking lot in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Among those arrested was Thomas Rousseau of Texas. He has been identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as the 23-year-old who founded the group. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates has banned the upcoming Pixar animated feature Lightyear from showing in movie theaters. The movie features actor Chris Evans voicing the inspiration for the Buzz Lightyear action figure from the Toy Story films. It reportedly includes a character voiced by actress Uzo Aduba kissing another woman with whom she's in a relationship. Malaysia is also expected to ban the film. Up next, Russia sells more oil to China and India. Sweden looks to resolve Turkey's concerns with NATO membership, and stocks continue to fall. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world coming up next, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily. India and other Asian nations are becoming an increasingly vital source of oil revenues for Moscow. The sales are boosting Russian export revenues at a time when Western allies are trying to limit Moscow's cash flows. India, an oil-hungry country of 1.4 billion people, has guzzled nearly 60 million barrels of Russian oil in 2022 so far. Now that's up from 12 million in all of 2021. The head of NATO is welcoming news that the Swedish government has confirmed what he calls its readiness to address Turkey's concerns. After decades of military non-alignment, Finland and Sweden both applied to join NATO in May, but alliance member Turkey has vetoed their entry. It's accusing the Nordic nations of supporting Kurdish militants deemed by Turkey to be terrorists. Sweden's prime minister says her country takes Turkey's concerns seriously and is looking to resolve the matter. Meanwhile, stock prices in the U.S. are falling for everything from bonds to Bitcoin. This comes as speculation rises that the U.S. Federal Reserve will move more aggressively on interest rates to get inflation under control, even if it risks a recession. Some of the biggest hits are being absorbed by cryptocurrencies, which soared early in the pandemic. This was when record low interest rates encouraged investors to bid up the riskiest investments. But Bitcoin tumbled more than 14% today and dropped below $23,400, according to CoinDesk. It's back to where it was in late 2020 and down from a peak of just under $69,000 late last year. Moving to the United Kingdom now, where the government has unveiled legislation that would unilaterally change post-Brexit trade rules for Northern Ireland. But that move will face opposition from lawmakers. This includes some in Prime Minister Boris Johnson's own Conservative Party, who believe it violates international law. The law would let the government bypass the Northern Ireland Protocol, which requires the inspection of some goods shipped to Northern Ireland from other parts of the UK. It's part of the broader trade deal that Mr. Johnson negotiated with the European Union when the UK left the 27-nation bloc. In South Korea, officials say that a week-long strike by thousands of truckers in the country has triggered major disruptions in cargo transport and production. It has caused $1.2 billion in damages. An extended strike may eventually worsen the global supply chains, which are already battered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's pandemic curbs. But observers say the strike's impact has so far been largely limited to South Korea's domestic industry, and the country hasn't reported any major disruption of exports of key items such as semiconductors. The fourth round of negotiations on Sunday between the striking truckers and government officials failed to reach a deal. A Swedish arms watchdog says the world's stockpiles of nuclear weapons are expected to increase in the coming years. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute says the decrease in recent decades seems to be reversing. This comes as all 9 nuclear-armed countries are expanding or upgrading their arsenals. The watchdog's Wilfred Wan calls it a very worrying trend. The U.S. and Russia hold 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. The UN Refugee Agency says tribal clashes over the past week have killed around 100 people in Sudan's war-ravaged Darfur region. A coordinator with the UNHCR says the fighting grew out of a land dispute between Arab and African tribes in the town of Kulbus. Toby Harward says local Arab militias then attacked multiple villages in the area, forcing thousands of people to flee. Since late last year, eruptions of tribal violence and surges in the fighting in Darfur have killed hundreds of people. Southern Iraq's Lake Sawwa has dried up for the first time in its centuries-long history. A combination of mismanagement by local investors, government neglect, and climate change has ground down its shores. The stress on water resources is driving up competition for the precious resource of ground salt among businessmen, farmers, and herders. Well, it has been described as an incredible gold mine for astronomy. The European Space Agency has released a trove of data on almost 2 billion stars in the Milky Way in an effort to create an accurate and complete map of our galaxy. Astronomers want to use the data to better understand how stars are born and die, and how the Milky Way evolved over billions of years. The Gaia mission also detected more than 100,000 so-called star quakes, which the agency likened to large tsunamis that ripple across the stars. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Take care, Canada.